Okay, and we're recording. Just a few announcements before Nick gets started here. WordPress 6.6 is set to be released on July 16th. Very, very exciting. The 6.6 beta 1 has been released, and I'm just going to drop that into, there's a link I'll drop in the chat. You can take a look, read about that. The What's New for Developers June edition is now live on the WordPress developer blog. So go and have a read of that. Keep yourself up to date on what's happening in WordPress and moving towards 6.6. And while you're there, you might as well just go ahead and subscribe to the developer blog as well to get all the updates for all the articles that come flying in. That was a nice little segue. See that?
Yeah.
Bang, bang, bang. All right. Well, I'm not going to take up too much more time other than to welcome everyone here and introduce Nick Diego, who's going to talk to us today about synced pattern overrides in WordPress 6.6. Nick, would you like to take over and go?
Sure. So thank you, Ryan. Right. So I am for those who don't know me, I am a developer advocate working full-time contributing to WordPress, sponsored by Automatic. Ryan is as well. And today we're going to be talking about, as Ryan mentioned, pattern overrides. So pattern overrides, it's an enhancement that is coming to synced patterns in WordPress 6.6. And it is, frankly, not the most developer-heavy feature. So you might be wondering, why are we talking about it in developer hours? Well, underneath pattern overrides is a lot of interesting developer-oriented topics. And so the idea today is to introduce you to a new enhancement coming in 6.6, which is coming out on July 16th, and then also kind of explain how it works, because how it works impacts other developer-oriented topics like content-only editing, the block bindings API, so on and so forth. So it's a pretty meaty topic, even though on the surface it doesn't feel maybe as developer-y as some of our previous sessions. All right, so I'm gonna start my screen recording, and we are just gonna dive in. All right, so real quick before we start, there's going to be a lot of resources in this session that we're going to share. Ryan will be sharing those in the chat, but you're also welcome to just pin or flag the Google Doc, and you can just copy all the links there. So this is the Google Doc. The links is in the chat. If you're watching this recording after the fact, the link to this doc will be in the show notes. Okay, so I'm going to take us on a bit of a journey. We're not going to talk about overrides until maybe like the latter half of this session, but please bear with me. Especially, I'm looking at our poll here, and a lot of folks, there are some people who don't even know what sync patterns are, which is great. We're going to cover that. A lot of folks, about 50%, 51%, have not experienced content-only editing, and basically nobody has started working with the block bindings API. So thank you all for participating in the poll. That helps a lot because we're going to be covering all of them. So if you answered no to any of those, don't worry, we're going to be covering it. So I want to start with something basic. Again, if you haven't played around with sync patterns, by me saying it's basic, please don't take offense to that. I'm just saying it's something that has been in WordPress for quite some time. So synced patterns were previously called reusable blocks. And the idea is that if you have a piece of content like this is like a little card. Unfortunately, you're going to see a lot of this little card layout in today's session because we're going to ship it through a bunch of different iterations. But right now, it's just blocks. If you look at the list view, we can see it's a group, and it's got a heading, it's got some paragraphs. It's just a little card. It's got some styling. Now, a synced pattern, the idea behind that is you take a group of blocks and you create a pattern out of them, and it's synced so that the content inside of this pattern, wherever you insert it, is the same. So let's just go ahead and do that and see what this looks like. So I'm going to go here. I'm going to go create pattern. And I'm going to make sure it's synced. So sync this pattern across multiple locations. We're going to call it synced card. We're going to add this. And now we have a synced card. If I come over here and I type in synced card, it adds the same content. If I edit this content like this, and I go back, you can see the other instance of my pattern now has the same content. This is a really useful mechanism in WordPress because if you're building a site for a client or whatever, and you want to say have content that is the same in multiple places, you create a synced pattern. The user can insert it wherever they want. And whenever that content needs to be changed, you change it in one place, you edit the original synced pattern, and then every other instance gets updated. It's really good, but there are use cases where it's not great. Think about our card setting. You might want the design to be the same on both, but pretty rarely in this scenario where you want the content to be the same. Maybe you want a special heading, you want a unique description, you want a unique link, but you want the design to be the same. So at the end of this session, we're going to get to talking about overrides, and that's what's going to solve that problem. So you'll have a pattern that is synced, but there's going to be specific fields or blocks within that pattern that the user can override and provide unique content for. The design and the structure of that pattern remains the same, and you can edit it just like you can with, so again, just to reinforce this, let's say that I want the background, instead of being white, to be this tan color, and I go back and see how they're both updated. So the idea behind a sync pattern with overrides is that you can do the same thing here. So you can modify the design and it updates in all the different places, but the content is unique to each one. So before we get there, I want to talk about how does that work? You rarely will actually need to know how it works. It's just going to work, and it actually is pretty delightful, and it all kind of just comes together. But the way it works is important for other contexts, other ways of either curating content or creating a different features inside of the editor from a developer's perspective. So what I want to start with is thinking about how this functionally works. And we're going to start with something called content-only editing. Content-only editing was introduced in 6.1. I'm going to come back down here and we're going to look at our same card example here. And with content-only editing, the idea is that when you present a client or a user with a really complicated layout, we look at this layout here, and our card is pretty simple, right? It just has a heading, some paragraphs, it's a stack. But there's a lot of things going on here. You click on the stack and you have all these settings, right? Click on the heading, there's still a ton of stuff going on over here. And if you're a designer and you are, or building a site for a client, and you want to provide a user with the ability to change the content inside of here, but you don't want them messing with all these settings, or maybe the client doesn't want to be messing, they don't want to be messing with them. It's not like, oh, we're going to prevent the client from doing this. Maybe they have, imagine like a school, like a university where has a lot of, students that come and work in the marketing department for a set period of time who don't have the knowledge of how the site editor works, anything like that. You want to provide a very straightforward editing experience for them where they're just editing the content and they're not messing with any of the other controls. That's where content only editing comes in. As the name suggests, it basically allows you to lock down a pattern or group of blocks using this simple attribute here that's called template lock content only editing. So there's no UI for this. You need to do it in the block markup. And very often you will be like, so if you create a theme, for example, and you have patterns in your theme, let's just come over here and look at 2024. So you can see how 2024 has all these different patterns in the theme. So what you would do in this case, for example, this, let's pick one here. How about call to action pricing? Okay. So this is one of the patterns in 2024. If we come over here, we can go to patterns. Let's see, call to action. And then we have our pricing. So that's this pattern here. I inserted it into my block. I did not want to do that. Let's insert it here. Call to action, pricing. Okay. This is the pattern that we're seeing in 2024 here. This pattern is quite complicated, right? It's got stacks and services and then columns and all this stuff going on in here. It's quite a lot. But what you can do is you can take this little attribute here, come over to your pattern. We'll add it at the top here. So now it says template lock content only. Save that. Now this is a traditional pattern. So there's no syncing involved. As soon as that pattern is inserted into the page, it is just blocks. So we need to start fresh. We need to delete this. Give it a refresh. Let's add that pattern again. Now, when we click on this, notice that I don't have as many options as I once did. If we go to the sidebar here, you can see that I have this different view. Let's just really quickly compare this to a normal block. So yeah, this is all the settings that you would have in a normal block. Down here now, I can just select individual blocks. I can make them bold or italics, and I can edit things. But I can't move stuff around. I can't delete blocks. I can't modify styling. I can just edit the content. So as the name suggests, content only editing, I now have a pattern that was inserted that the user can edit the content for, but they can't actually change the design. So this is a really powerful topic or really powerful feature that you can introduce in patterns or in templates. And you might think, well, why are you talking about this? We're supposed to be talking about overrides. Well, the functionality that powers content only editing is used in pattern overrides, which we'll see in a bit. So if you haven't tried out content only editing and you build themes for, mass distribution or for clients, I strongly recommend looking into it because and in that doc, there's some additional resources. It's really powerful when you're providing patterns like this, or when you're creating templates for specific post types. So imagine you had a custom post type for, say, books, I don't know, something that's specific. You could create a template. So whenever that a user goes in to edit a book, they are presented with basically what amounts to a form field where they, use your imagination and pretend that this is what you would saw whenever you went to a book post type. You'd be able to edit all the content for the book. Granted, this is a horrible example, but you would, imagine you change the title, you change the description, you change the author, so on and so forth. You could even update the book cover, book jacket cover, but the general layout of what that book custom post type looks like in the editor is fixed, and you control that at the theme level. And it can be very powerful. So, so if you haven't tried out content only editing, it's a very great feature, and there's a lot of different applications for it. So,
Nick, there's a question in chat. I don't know if you want to answer it now, but I just didn't want to get lost.
Yeah, go for it.
And the question is from Sean. It says, can you designate a synced pattern in the header of your theme/pattern files? Like in the header pattern PHP file, something like synced true. I think.
Thank you for calling this out, Sean, because we're going to get to this being a limitation. So synced patterns. So let me go back up to our synced pattern. This synced pattern is saved in the database. There is no way currently to designate in your pattern file synced equals true. This is something that is going to be I don't want to say fairly large, but a large limitation of pattern overrides. But once we get to that, we'll talk about what does the future look like? Because a lot of times when you're working with synced patterns, so let me back up. Imagine you build a theme for a client, and that theme, like we see here with 2024, is all specified out in PHP files. Maybe that's under version control. And you want to have a synced pattern where the content does not change and the user can put it in different places of their website and it all syncs together. You could imagine a world where you would want to serve that just like you would in a normal pattern with PHP, synced equals true, something like that. And then whenever you as the agency or something wants to update that content, you just update it in the file, push an update to the theme, and then all those sync patterns get updated. That's like a very elegant workflow that a lot of people have been asking for, and that it has been requested, and it is something that is on the kind of the long-term roadmap. We don't have that currently today. So that is a limitation when it comes to sync patterns. They are stored in the database. It's great from a user experience because you can just go quickly make sync patterns. You can edit them. You can update them. It's a very nice workflow inside of the editor, but we don't have that connection back to the theme files. That again, that's going to come up again when we talk about overrides, because as powerful and as cool as overrides are, that unfortunately is one of the limitations. Anything else, Ryan?
Yep, there's one more question about content only, whether or
Yep,
not it can be used in custom blocks or in inner blocks within a custom block.
it can. I don't have the resource on the top of my brain, but in the block.json file of your block, I believe you can specify template lock true, which will allow that. So there is a way of doing it. I apologize, I don't know off the top of my head exactly what it is, but you can.
I'll look it up in here.
All right, so no, actually I do want to specify that a little bit because it is still a relatively simplistic feature in the sense that when we look at this, for example, our this block that I turned into content only, if you look at the content here, it's pretty basic. We got paragraphs, we got headers, and we got buttons. When you start talking about custom blocks that can be really complicated, that's where things start to kind of break down a little bit. We're going to talk about the block bindings API in a second, and that's another feature that is fairly limited currently in the scope of what blocks it supports and what attributes it supports. But creating a mechanism for custom blocks to opt in and provide ways of working with the block bindings API and things like content only editing are kind of on that future. So this is kind of the first step in getting all the kind of the foundational components in place. Like you need to have your paragraphs, you need to have your headings, so on and so forth. And then as we move forward, greater extensibility for custom blocks will be coming. But you can do a ton with it, but it is still relatively limited once you start getting to the custom block domain. Okay, so we've kind of covered the content only editing piece of it. And the reason this is important is because imagine our synced pattern here. We want, if this is going to be a synced pattern with overrides, we want the user to still be able to edit the heading, the description, and the link. So if you can imagine, this is where we're at now. This is a fully synced pattern. We want to get to a place where it's kind of like this. They can click on the heading, change the heading. They can click on the content, but the rest of it remains in sync. So that's we've kind of covered half of it with content only editing. Now we need to cover the second part of it. And that is where the block bindings API comes in. So the block bindings API was introduced in WordPress 6.5. If you refer to the resources docs, and Ryan can drop some links, it is super powerful. It is an incredibly cool feature. Justin Tadlock, one of our colleagues, has written, I think, 4 posts on the developer blog at this point by now on how to use the block bindings API in different ways. I highly recommend reading the first one. It's just the introduction to block bindings API part 1. It kind of goes through what's currently available, and we're going to use some of that in this demo here. What the block bindings API does is it allows you to bind metadata to blocks. So if we go back and think about our synced pattern for a second, if we allow a user to change the heading, change the description, change the link, but keep the content the same, we need a way of connecting those edits to the synced pattern. And the way that's going to work under the hood is using the block bindings API. So the pattern overrides feature is intrinsically linked to the block bindings API, which I'll cover in more detail in a second. So when we talk about limitations or where do we go from here, what are the additional features we want to see, they need to start in the block bindings API, because the more powerful the block bindings API gets, the more powerful pattern overrides will get. So just keep that kind of tenet in mind as we move forward, because any limitations in the block bindings API are inherently linked to any limitations in the pattern overrides feature. So here we have just some blocks. We don't have patterns yet. We just have our normal blocks. And they look the same as they did before. But if I click on this, you'll see that there's this little purple indicator. And on the right-hand side, you'll see that it says bindings. So I should have mentioned this earlier, and I apologize for not doing so. We are running WordPress 6.6 beta 1. So I'm using the beta tester plugin. Gutenberg is not active. So this is what we're seeing here is, yes, some things might change a little bit as we go through the beta process for the 6.6 release, but this is 6.6. So no Gutenberg, no nothing. This is 6.6. So you see here that they're kind of highlighted in purple, and I'm seeing that there's bindings set over here. Now, what I've put together here is a very simple example of block bindings, and it's using post meta. So if you're familiar with custom fields and post meta, that's what we're using here. So if I come here and I turn on preferences, and I come down here and turn on custom fields, you can see our custom fields at the bottom here. This is where our custom fields are. And right now, sorry, let me back up. What I've done is in the theme, now you could do this in a plugin, but just for keeping things simple, I did it in a theme. I have registered a bunch of custom post meta. So we have card heading, card description, card text link, zoom in a little bit, card button text, card button URL. And this is post meta. You probably wouldn't do this in real life, right? Like it doesn't make sense for a post to have card heading for post meta. But this is just for example purposes. The block bindings API allows you to connect this post meta to a block, to the output of a block. Now you can also register custom meta, custom block bindings that connect to custom meta, which there's an article for that. We're not going to cover that today. We're just going to use kind of the default, which is post meta. But what I've done is I've registered all of these and I've given them defaults. That is why you see, that's why it doesn't look any different, because I gave the defaults the same. But watch here when I change the default for the card header. We change this, save, and I refresh this page. You can see that it comes through as test. So the content of this heading block is connected to post meta. Now, one of the coolest things happened recently in 6.6. So again, block bindings was introduced in 6.5, last release. In 6.6, it's got a lot of like under the hood improvements, nothing new, no new major features. But one of the cool things is that you can now modify the post meta in the block. So watch this. So this is my header and see how it's updating over here. We're going to save this, and now it says the following has been modified: block bindings API, post meta. So this is actually updating the registered post meta for card heading, which is super cool. Can save this. And now we have the post meta down here. You have to, unfortunately, the meta box thing is a little bit funky, but you can see here card heading and my header is showing up down here. So this is really cool because in 6.5, there was you couldn't edit the content directly in the block, and now you can for post meta, which I think is amazing. Block bindings, super cool. Articles all about how to do custom meta, how to do the default functionality. Highly encourage you to take a look at that. But let's think about how this actually works. So this is going to be important for when we get to the pattern overrides. So what happens is, if I look at this block, and I'll look at it in a second, but if I look at the code view of this block, there is an attribute called metadata. And inside of that, there's bindings, and then there's content. And then I'm defining the source. Let me zoom in a little bit here. I'm defining the source that data is coming from. And in this case, is coming from core post meta. And then I'm defining the key which to pull from. So this is the card heading, which is exactly the same that you're seeing here, card heading. This attribute just gets applied to the block just like any other attribute. If you're not familiar with block attributes, let's just take a quick look. We can see here, let's look for meta. Here we go. So here's that heading block. And you can see that it says metadata, bindings, content, exact same thing I had in the code example. So that's how we are connecting this block to the block binding using this metadata and this bindings attribute. Now, you'll notice here that it says content. Well, that is what you're binding the post meta to. So in the case of headings, because it's a headings block that I'm adding this attribute to, headings supports content. If we look at other blocks like buttons support more things like the text and the URL. So as of 6.6, these are the supported attributes. It's pretty limited, but you can still do quite a bit with it. So an image, you can bind a URL, an alt, or a title. Paragraph is content, heading is content, button is URL, text, link, target, and row. So these are the attributes that you can bind content to. This is important because these are the same attributes that you can create pattern overrides for. So this kind of goes back to my point about the intrinsic link between the block bindings API and pattern overrides, which we'll see in 1 second. Why do we need this piece, right? We have the content only editing, which is kind of locking down the pattern. We need the block bindings API to store the values that the user is entering into those different content only editing fields and writing it to the pattern. So that's why we need the two pieces. We need the content only editing and we need the block bindings API working together to create our pattern overrides. Does anybody have any questions about the block bindings API? Because it was kind of an abridged overview of how the feature works.
There's some questions around, well, one person's asking specifically about, is this compatible for ACF or pods?
Mm-hmm.
I answered that anything registered to the post meta table that's exposed to the REST API, I would assume it technically would be available via the source, the post meta source.
Yeah, and so
that doesn't mean it knows about all your connections and everything like that, but individual pieces of meta should be able to, you should be able to connect them there.
yeah, and there's the article that Justin wrote on connecting custom metadata. Take a look at that one. Because that one,
link that again in the chat.
Because that one basically shows you how to do just that. You can connect any data. You could connect like the editor name, the author name, and like you can connect anything. You're really just limited to these fields that you can connect data to. And also at this point in the block bindings API, there's no support for custom blocks. That is on the roadmap, right now between 6.5 and 6.6, it's like, okay, let's get the core really rock solid. And that's where the focus is right now. But there are plans to have an opt-in mechanism for custom blocks where you can say, hey, my custom block X, I want to support content, text, whatever, and you opt in the different attributes that are supported. And then you probably need some sort of mechanism in terms of like how that content is displayed. But like that is coming in the future. Right now, we just have these limited fields. But if you had like a custom ACF value and you want to bind that to a paragraph, there should be no problem with that. You just need to have a custom binding source. So instead of using post meta, so let me go back up here, sorry. So instead of the source being core/post meta, you would register a custom binding source and you create that. And whatever that custom binding source returns, that's what you're applying to the block. So I'm making it seem maybe more simple here. You can do a ton with it. So encourage you to check it out. Anything else, Ryan?
There was a question about user roles and synced patterns, which I don't know if you're going to talk about that sooner or later, but basically are sync patterns locked for editors and contributors, and they can they only be created by administrators because you're in the site editor. I guess in your example, you're in the site editor there.
Well, I'm actually in just the post edit. I'm just in the normal editor right here. So you can create patterns. Well, I don't know if we want our spacer here to be a sync pattern, but we could. You can create patterns from just the normal page and post editor.
I think the question is more around the editor role or the user roles that are allowed to create. I guess if you can create content, you can create a async pattern because you're essentially saving the database either way. I don't know. Sorry, that's a guess. I have no idea.
I should know the answer to this. And I don't. I feel like that there's a way to disable it, but I'm going to hedge and say that there is. I don't know offhand. There is, no, not news. There is a section of the site called Curating the Editor Experience. So
I did drop a link to that in there. Yeah.
if it isn't explained in this section somewhere, I will make sure it is. Yeah, I don't want to. Yeah, I don't want to like just waste everyone's time by searching the documentation that anyone else can read. But I do think that's a great question. That is a fantastic question, and I think my hedge is yes, but I would need to double check on that.
Well, and I think that was it for questions.
Perfect. All right. Well, we're officially 35 minutes in, and I haven't used pattern overrides. So let's resolve that. So let's come back over here. Actually, no, we need a new page here. Okay, we're back to our card example. So I am, hopefully I'm going to illustrate here why this feature is so powerful and why we need to continually expand on it in the future. Because right now the implementation is fairly limited, but if you kind of visualize where this could go, it could ultimately be one of the most powerful features in the block editor. And I truly mean that from like a site management, site building perspective. So one of the things that when I used to do a lot more, but when I do education on how to efficiently build in the site editor, I always have like this approach of design once and duplicate. So normally this is a 2-column layout, right? And so normally what you would want is you'd want 2 cards side by side. And I duplicated the wrong way. But you'd want something like this, right? Instead of designing both, like, okay, well maybe I want the border radius to be 10 pixels. Oh crap, now I got to go over here and edit it in 10 pixels. You know what I mean? That process of like designing and then having to go like update thing, it's a lot. And when I watch people who are using the editor for the first time, managing all these settings is tough. And so when you're building something that needs to be replicated multiple times, like columns, or maybe it's a specific design, um, designing once and then duplicating is the best way to do that. And that is why patterns are so powerful, because you can design a great looking pattern and then the user can just insert that and then modify their content. The problem comes when, I'll speak for myself here, I design something and I think it looks great one day, and then I implement it all over my website. And then I'm like, I really wish that the border radius was 10 pixels. Well, now I've inserted it all over my website. I got to go to each instance of that and modify all the border radius. Or maybe you want to change color, maybe you want to change fonts, whatever. That process is challenging. And when we didn't have the block editor and you're working with just like, template files and mainly in code, updating those things would be a lot easier because you'd just be doing it in code. Of course, you'd have the trade-off where you couldn't do anything visually and you had to do everything in code, but there are certain elements of that workflow that were easier. So the goal of pattern overrides is to solve that. So what you have is you need to think about, okay, what do I want the content to be? So that's going to be fixed. So we want, this is a card. We want it to have a heading. We want it to have a description. We want it to have some sort of call to action. In this case, we're going to just have a simple link. So I know that that's the content. The content is not going to change. The design could change drastically, but that's kind of the content that I want to display. So I start here. I'm just going to delete the duplicate one. I start here and I say, okay, first thing I want to do is I want to create a synced pattern. So the exact same thing that we did before. What do I want to call this? How about card with overrides? So the exact same thing we did before, we created a card that is synced and is now a synced pattern. Again, we go back to that problem where the synced patterns are stored in the database. They're not stored in theme files. That's something that hopefully a bridge we can cross in the future. But right now, that is one of the limitations. But hopefully that doesn't, I don't want to belittle the power of this because it is, just watch, it is very powerful. Now I want to duplicate it. So I have my two cards. I like the way it looks right now. And I want to duplicate this. I'll move it over to another next column. We're back to where we were before. I can edit the original. I can change the design. I can change the colors, everything, but I can't change the content. So now what we want to do is we want to enable overrides and allow the user to edit the content. So what we're going to do, I'm just going to turn off custom fields right now because every time I see that meta box at the bottom, it's a little bit annoying. If you watched one of our previous developer hour sessions with Ryan and I about the future of meta boxes, that was a good one. Hopefully meta boxes won't be around. Okay, so we're at this point now. I can edit the original. Let me just make this a little bit smaller so it's more realistic. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to click on different portions of my pattern that I want to be the user to be able to override. I'm going to come down under advanced and you'll see a button that says enable overrides. And when you click this, it's going to ask for a name. This is very important. So every time you create a pattern override, you need to give it a name. This name basically tells WordPress and the Block Bindings API, how do I connect whatever the user enters to the place in the pattern it should be. So that's kind of what's happening here. You have to give it a name. So we'll just do something simple as like card header. Then we'll come down and click on the description, enable this. And then we'll give this a name as well. And the cool thing here is that when we look at the list view, for a user, it's kind of nice. It says card header, card description, card link. They kind of know what they're supposed to do when they deal with these overrides. So now if we go back, before we couldn't change any of this. But watch, when I click on it now, it's going to flash purple a little bit. And then we're going to have the content piece that looks a whole lot like content only editing, right? I'm just gonna hammer this point. I'm sure you all are like, yes, we get it. But if we come down here to that pattern I created, of course I deleted it, didn't I? All right, well, I won't recreate it, but it's the exact same thing as the content only editing. So now when I click on card header, I can just create a new header. I can update this one here. I can update the link. So not only can I change the title, I can also change where it's going to. So maybe WordPress.org. And I can make basically changes however I want. So we've combined block bindings and content only editing, but we still retain the power of a synced pattern. So we go to the edit the original. Maybe I want to go to the group here. Maybe I want to, I don't know, change the background back to this color. Maybe we don't want any border radius, something like that. We go back and there we go. Our cards are updated. So this is a way for you to, and these are super simple examples, right? Because they're just cards. But this is a way that you can basically create an editing experience for users or clients where they can modify the changes. But you, as kind of the manager of the site, or even for yourself, I've been using this for myself as well, you can later change the design with ease and you have full control over that. But when you go and edit the content, you have this very clean, kind of almost like form-like editing experience where you just like fill out the fields that are available to you, and that's it. I want to take this one step further because I think that you can even go really far and drastically change things. So let's go here. And I'm going to just bear with me for a second. We're going to now, I do want to call out one thing. So if you're watching this after 6.6 comes out, this will not be a problem. Any of the eagle eye people here may have noticed that the padding is a little bit different when I'm in this view from when I go back. That is a bug. It has already been noted in the WordPress 6.6 release process. That will be fixed. So the padding looks different here than when we go to edit original. That's a bug and will be fixed. So I'm going to group this here. I'm going to, before this, I'm going to add an image. So that is the importance of the beta release process. Bugs are found and bugs are fixed. Go to our media library. Let's insert this one. And we'll remove the padding on the outside. Okay. Let's go back to 8. Go back to, there we go. Now let's go back to white. Okay. Now when we go back, we have this little card design. I forgot to make one more edit. I'm a little bit, it's got to be perfect. 7. There we go. Okay, so we have this nice little card design. Sorry, I gotta make one more. I keep forgetting. We want to, and this is kind of the I'm fiddling around with these little design elements, but this is the power of this, right? Like I'm making these subtle changes. I'm realizing, oh, I don't want block spacing because I want this to be closer. I'm realizing that, oh, actually, instead of just having default border radius of 7, it really shouldn't be at the bottom because the bottom shouldn't, So you're making all these little changes and you only have to do it once. And I find that so cool. And now this one's updated. But at this point, they have the same image, right? Which is not what you want. Or maybe you do. Maybe there's a scenario where maybe if you have like a, I don't know, an icon or, you know, some sort of like design where the image is the same and the image is no longer editable, see, because it's not part of the content. But if I wanted to make that image editable, all I need to do is add an override. So I'll go back to edit original, come down here, enable overrides. We'll do card image, enable. And now when we click on the image, you can see that it flashes purple, just like all the other content. You can edit that card image, you can replace it. And it keeps the aspect ratio that was set in the pattern. And all the user can do is replace it, do the alt, the title, so on and so forth. And you can reset, which is pretty cool. So you can reset everything. So see, this goes back to card heading. You can reset. This is a unique image, so we reset that back. So there's a lot of really simplistic editing experience in here that you can provide people without giving them the full-blown all of the settings. But it's also really handy when you want to deliver a design that maybe you want to change it in the future. So the key part about this, though, is that, as I've been mentioning a few times now, is that this has the same limitations as the block bindings API. So, for example, if we go to edit original and maybe I add, I'm just thinking of something that I know doesn't work. If we add a code block and we go to advanced, there's no override option. So overrides are only available for the same blocks that are available with the block bindings API. And just as a little refresher, go to that. That is these blocks here. So image, paragraph, headings, and buttons. So that is a limitation, but remember, the block bindings API is only actually was released in the last release. We only 6.6 is only the second release with the block bindings API. It will get more powerful in the future. There will be an opt-in mechanism for custom blocks in the future. Once those are implemented in the block bindings API, all that functionality will kind of flow into overrides, which will make the feature more powerful. But I highly encourage you to start exploring how overrides can kind of change your workflow when it comes to building sites. I've already started using it myself in terms of just creating content that I, maybe want to change in the future. I'm not entirely sure about, and it's just straight content, headings and paragraphs and buttons. Make it a synced pattern with overrides. And then if you want to change it in the future, fine. Make a few little design tweaks, and everywhere you've added that synced pattern, it all updates. That's fantastic.
The question in chat, Nick, about edits. The question's from Kevin, and it says, "Are edits tracked in the block attributes, or is everything in the DB?
In the database, yeah,
or are they tracked at all?"
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know. I did see an issue about revisions. Not an issue, but like a comment about revisions in the tracking issue. So in the resources here, there's the core tracking issue
there now.
Yeah. So if you want to learn more about like the mechanics of overrides and everything behind it, check out this tracking issue. It's going to extend beyond 6.6 and it has all the details that you might need. I personally think that the database requirement of this feature is perfectly fine for use cases like your own website or whatever. But to make this feature really powerful, connecting it to theme files, I think is a must, because you can imagine a scenario where you had your pattern file. Let's just pretend banner hero is one of them, and you define that this is a synced pattern with overrides. You define which heading, like for example, in this case is a heading. You would define here that says this heading is overridable. Obviously the spacer is not. Maybe this paragraph's overridable. So you could just define in your theme file what is a synced pattern, what are the overrides. I think that'd be amazingly powerful. And then it's just shipped with the theme, and then they become available to the user inside of the editor. So there's been a ton of discussion around that in GitHub and in the developer community around kind of this feature. And I think that it will come eventually. And because now, before, when these discussions happened, we didn't have the mechanics of just making this thing work to begin with. And now we do. With content only editing and the block bindings API, we have like the mechanism to make this functional. So now it's like, how do we take this further? Excuse me. So keep an eye on this, test it the way it is today. And actually, we don't have a link for this here, but in WordPress Slack, there's an outreach channel. And I encourage you to test this and provide your feedback on the outreach channel. What do you like about it? What don't you like about it? Where would you like to see it go in the future? Because now that we have something that functions, yes, it's not in theme files and it's just in the database, but it functions really well for this kind of small set of functionality. Now it's like, okay, where do we go from here? How do we extend this further? Or are there bugs or other things that, maybe should work a little differently? So I think that's really part of the discussion and part of the reason why we wanted to not only showcase the new feature that is coming in 6.6, because it is very cool, but really kind of talk about like how it works under the hood, and then also start thinking about where do we go from here? Because I really think that this is only kind of like the first step with patterns with overrides. Because man, it could, like, if you could have a mechanism where you could opt in a custom block, because you can imagine a scenario where you have a custom block that, I don't know, displays an icon or who knows what. There are a lot of scenarios where you'd want a custom block as part of your design. If you could register that as overridable and you provide some sort of mechanism for how it could be overridable, so that a user could come and you could define reusable block, synced pattern with overrides. You could create really complicated designs that like are really complicated from the list view perspective, that with overrides become super simple. The user just comes in here, they change the title, they change the description. Maybe they have a choice to change an icon, they change the image, design remains fixed. You have full control over the design. That I think would be really, really powerful. And then if you can sync that back to the theme files, then you're golden. You can keep that in version control. You can do whatever you want to do from a developer perspective. So this is kind of a taste at where we could head in the future, but it is still very powerful within this kind of limited use case. So,
Hey Nick, can you show what this would look like if you now inserted a new version of this card? There's a question, a couple of questions. One is how to get the code for this that was answered in chat. Like, you switch to the code editor view, you can copy and paste that into a pattern. But the question was about setting the default image, which is what you've done here. So now that you've set this up, if you just insert a new card with overrides block, will that get all that stuff?
yeah, let me just add one that's not the default. So,
Right.
all right. So if I will, let me get rid of this code block because that's not great. All right. So these are edited. This is edited. This one's not. So if I go down here and I add my synced card. Wait, is that the one? No, is it? Card with overrides.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's it.
You're going to get
so there you go. So when you define this question's from, I think it's pronounced Manzur. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, but basically when you create your pattern that represents this synced pattern, you define the defaults, and then you indicate what within that pattern you can override.
right.
So I'm saying that correctly.
Yeah, let me save this real quick. So if we edit the original here and we maybe set change the default, maybe the default is, I don't know, this one. When I go back, any pattern that didn't set its own image, well, the default will be updated to whatever the default is. So what I've been showing here is I've been showing this kind of new flow where you can edit the original and you're all like here, you're still in the editor, the post editor, but these are also carried over to the site editor as well. So I like the flow of everything is kind of contained. So that's why I didn't go into the site editor, but you definitely can. And this is another workflow that you might be working completely in the site editor. So if you go under patterns now, and we go to my patterns, you can see that we have my card with overrides and then my just the standard synced card. So you can edit them here in the site editor as well. So the only, well, it looks a little funny because my card design is not meant to be this big, but you know, you can adjust the sidebar to the toggles to make it more realistic. But yeah, so you can edit either in the site editor in the normal pattern view, or you can edit it kind of in that flow with just editing your page or post. Any other questions?
Muted. I'm muted. Nobody can hear me. There's a related question, but not really related around in the pattern that this generates when you put this into a file, how you can have that default image be from the theme directory as opposed to being from the media uploads
Right.
on
So
the site. I'd imagine you just rewrite your PHP path to link to the URL of the
right.
image in your theme, like with get style sheet URL path to thing.
Yeah. So, but just to reiterate, like these overrides and sync patterns can't be put in themes. You could create a default pattern that's just a pattern that isn't synced and doesn't have overrides that just looks like this. Again, no overrides, no syncing. You could put that pattern in your theme, and then when a user inserts that pattern, they could then turn it into a synced pattern. But again, we don't have that connection between patterns that are synced in theme files. The patterns that are included in your theme, forgive me for saying they're dumb, but they're just like simple dumb, like they don't do anything. They just insert blocks. They don't have, there's no syncing, there's no pattern overrides, there's nothing. The only thing you can do with a pattern in your patterns folder is do the content only editing. But none of the syncingness can happen with patterns in your theme files. But again, hopefully that will change in the future because that would be very powerful.
Well, thank you for clarifying that.
All right, well,
I
we're almost at time, but I do want to share one thing. Did I put it in the notes here? Maybe I did, maybe I didn't. I don't think I did.
then
So the next event is going to be a good one. So this kind of touched on some theme stuff, because pattern overrides are intrinsically linked to themes. But the next session that we're going to be holding on June 25th, it's already up on Meetup, is going to be kind of a broad discussion with Justin Tadlock and myself about what's new for theme developers in 6.6. So kind of like the most important things you need to know if you're a theme developer or manage themes or build themes for others in 6.6. So hopefully you'll join us for that session as well. As always, these sessions are recorded, so if you can't make it or whatever, they will be recorded and put on WordPress.tv, and then eventually YouTube as well. So yeah, hope you'll join us there. Anything else on your end, Ryan? You're muted.
thanks. This is my first day with Zoom. Did you drop that in chat? I
did
can.
not.
I did not. Let me just maybe if you have it there, maybe it's faster if you just drop it in there because I don't.
Of course, I can't find my chat window here. Yeah, I got it.
Okay, thanks. Sorry. The one job I had. Stay unmuted and talk.
Yeah.
And drop links.
Did
Cool.
great.
All right. Well, thank you, Nick, for this enlightening presentation. I've learned a lot. I hope we all have. And I don't know. I think we're about a minute over here, so I don't know. I have nothing else to add unless there's anything you have to add. Maybe we can say thanks and so long and thanks for all the fish and go from there.
All right. Thanks everybody. Hopefully we'll see you in the next one.
All right. Bye all.